strike gets called off, but 2 others are still threatened. So as the summer of discontent goes on for passengers, is intransigence by the unions, the employers or the government to blame? Good evening. The Transport Secretary accuses the unions of holding passengers to ransom. The unions say the government has sabotaged talks. And the employers are saying sorry to anyone using the railways this summer. Certainly on an increasing number of routes, a series of industrial actions means no one's getting anywhere very fast. So does this signal a return to the bitter disputes of the past? And are Conservative ministers, as they were in the past, prepared to crush the unions? We'll ask a union boss and a senior Tory MP live.
Also tonight, Donald Trump causes outrage again. But are his latest comments suggesting gun owners could use their right to bear arms to stop Hillary Clinton becoming president a step too far, even for some Republicans? Along the glittering skyline, it's Cowes Week on the Isle of Wight, the island the Ofsted chairman David Hoare called a ghetto. He's apologised, but it's shone a light on the problem of underachieving children from the white working class here and elsewhere in Britain. And as a report suggests, more than half of all women experience sexual harassment at work. Should employers take a tougher line, or should women toughen up?
And as the sporting action in Rio hots up, so does the environmental action. Dozens of celebrities are urging the Brazilian government not to dam an untouched tributary of the River Amazon. We speak to the chief of the Munduruku tribe, who says his people's very existence is under threat. Well, if you use the railways, some good news tonight. The next 2 days of strikes on Southern Rail by members of the RMT have been suspended as talks restart. But if you're planning to travel by Eurostar at the weekend or over the August bank holiday, the very same union has announced industrial action there. The Eurostar dispute is in fact the third that the RMT has launched in recent weeks against different rail operators, as Michael Crick now reports.
Commuters tonight at London's Victoria Station. They're naturally pleased this week's strike has been suspended, but rail passengers' troubles are far from over. The RMT union has instructed its members to resume normal working from 10 o'clock tonight, but because of planning problems, Southern Trains warns that tomorrow's services will only be based on the strike timetable like today, although they hope to do rather better than that, and then resume normal services on Friday. But even then, those services will only be based on the revised and rather reduced timetable that was in force before the strike. The talks will resume at ACAS tomorrow. This dispute is largely about train conductors operating train doors. In future, Southern want drivers to open and close doors, but say conductors will still be on board to look after passengers, except in exceptional circumstances, such as staff shortages, when trains could have just a driver. The RMT insists on always 2 staff per train.
Why doesn't anyone ever ask the question if trains are safe without conductors in a lot of cases? Why are they worried?
So you blame the RMT rather than the company?
I do.
It's just having someone there, I think, is a kind of comfort thing. Whether they'd be able to help or do anything is another question, but I think people just like to know there's a person on a train. No one wants to be on a train with 800 people and there's no one on it.
Southern Rail! Southern Fail! This morning, the 3rd day of their strike, RMT members protested outside the Department for Transport.
They're trying to get in a situation where that guarantee of a guard in every train goes. And they'll be able to run trains with only one person on that, which is the train driver. So ultimately it is about jobs, but predominantly about making sure we run a safe railway, safe trains, safe passengers.
The RMT held today's demo at the Transport Department because they say a top civil servant there, Peter Wilkinson, is very hostile to the union. In February, in a meeting at Croydon Town Hall, Mr. Wilkinson told commuters,
over the next 3 years, we're going to be having punch-ups and we will see industrial action, and I want your support.
Of train drivers, he said,
we have got to break them.
Adding,
they will have to decide if they want to give a good service or get the hell out of my industry.
Those comments include...
Last month, MPs asked Wilkinson about what he'd said.
Would you like to explain to us how you came to make such statements?
I have gone on record as apologising for offence caused in association with those events. I stand by that apology. I regret very much any offence that has been taken.
The new Transport Secretary was in Derby today to unveil a £1 billion contract for new trains for East Anglia. Relatively quiet on the issue till now, Chris Grayling said this about Southern and other planned rail strikes.
I think the RMT, frankly, are being utterly thoughtless about their passengers, their customers. This series of strikes that only damages people who travel on the railways is simply unacceptable.
But rail staff aren't happy these days. On Eurostar today, RMT and the white-collar union TSSA announced strikes for this weekend and over the bank holiday over shift patterns. And yesterday, RMT members voted for strike action on the Virgin East Coast Main Line over pay, conditions and safety.
And Michael Crick is outside the Department of Transport in Westminster now. So, Michael, what's happening with the Eurostar strike?
Well, that is on 7 days over the next month. Just 7 days over the next month. The first batch of days is this weekend, Friday, Saturday, Sunday and Monday. And then the second batch of days is over the bank holiday weekend, the Saturday, Sunday and Monday. But it's likely to be less disruptive than the strikes that we've seen on Southern trains over the last 3 days, because it'll only be one train per day. So most passengers won't be affected. It's about, the unions say that they're basically striking about the management's failure to fulfil what they regard as promises over their work-life balance. They say that the Eurostar management, back in 2008, promised to come up with proposals which would make their work-life balance better, give them more time, more convenient hours to see friends and family and so on. And they say they've lost their patience, they're fed up that the management, they say, hasn't come up with such proposals. That's why they're going on strike.
Michael, thanks very much. Well, we're joined now by Mick Lynch, the Assistant General Secretary of the Rail, Maritime and Transport Union, and by the Conservative MP Crispin Blunt, who's just back from that commuter protest. Mick Lynch first. OK, the Southern strike has been suspended. There may be hope there. But strikes afoot at Virgin and Eurostar. I'm assuming that you'll apologise to passengers, will you?
I apologise to passengers disrupted. We take no pleasure in having industrial disputes. We don't want our members to be in dispute. We don't want the public to be disrupted and inconvenienced.
Well, so take the Southern dispute, for example. 306 conductors wreaking havoc with 300,000 passengers' lives. That doesn't seem fair, does it?
Well, there's a very large company involved, Govia, who are disrupting the railway on a daily basis of their own volition. Our members are standing up for safety on the railway. They're standing up for a whole raft of safety competencies, 32 separate safety competencies involved in operating the railway to the proper standards. Govia and the other train operating companies, backed by the Department for Transport, are seeking to deregulate the railway, seeking to lower the safety standards so that they can extract more profit and dehumanise the railway to take staff away.
Crispin, this is over a point of safety. It's a valid strike.
Well, if that was the case, then the rail safety supervisor, the body that overlooks rail safety, might have said so, but it isn't. This is all about a restrictive practices dispute that looks as though it's straight out of the 1970s. We should be beyond this. We actually need...
Oh, so you think that the government should tackle it as was done in the 70s and the 80s? The government should try and break this strike, do you? Well, the government are standing behind Govia, as they should do, but they also need to be standing with passengers, who are the ones, my constituents, who use this line, as do all the MPs who represent people using the Brighton Main Line, who have had an absolutely dreadful service ever since the investment into London Bridge began, and that was 20 months ago. So this is not just last week or this week or today's strike. This has been ongoing with a very much diminished service, and this dispute just adds insult to injury. And it's been preceded by months of unofficial action with people just not turning up for work.
Sure, but standing behind passengers, does that mean the government putting more investment into the railways?
Well, this franchise has a peculiarity in as much as Govia are paid to manage the railway, but the fare income goes straight from the fare-paying customers to the Department for Transport. Now, any business that was giving a rotten service that hadn't been contracted for with its passengers or expecting their customers, expecting something a great deal better, would be paying them compensation. Getting compensation is quite difficult in the railways. Delay repay is clunky to do. And the service levels are absolutely atrocious for a whole variety of reasons, of which this dispute is but one.
But should the government be putting more money into the railways generally? Because this comes down to a point about money, doesn't it?
Well, it does come down to a point about money. And the people who use this line are in what's so-called a negative subsidy area. They're actually subsidising the rest of the network. This busiest commuter line in the country is being milked, and the people who run it are milked, and they're being abused by the fact that that everyone appears to be in some kind of conspiracy against them, either to see that they're not properly recompensed when they get a dreadful service, or to help provide a dreadful service for them.
Mick, the Southern dispute is essentially over who closes the doors.
No.
The Eurostar is a dispute about work-life balance. These are, to quote the Transport Secretary, pretty minor matters, aren't they?
Well, the Transport Secretary knows very little about this dispute. There is no dispute about opening and closing doors. It's about safety-critical work, 32 separate competencies, one of which is the control of the powered doors. We're not in dispute about opening and closing doors, despite what the government says. There has been no unofficial action on Southern or anywhere else. What we need is an agreement on the safe operation of the railways.
Do you explain the sickness rates before?
I don't explain the sickness rates. I'm not responsible for sickness at Southern. You explain your government's choice of putting Charles Horton in charge of this railway, who failed the Connex franchise, paying him £2.5 million a year. This man is a specialist in failure, but you're backing him to the hilt.
Is this the right moment to knee the customers further in the
There's
groin?
no right moment. Is it the right moment for Southern to impose new contracts on the 21st of August?
You know just...
Should we just wait while that happens?
You know exactly the stress this service is under.
And I know
since the investment
went
into London Bridge, when there is substantial investment going in, but it's going to take until 2018 to get that investment
So why
in
does
place.
Southern choose this time to impose new contracts and get rid of guards?
And, well, then take it to the rail safety regulator. Thank goodness it's going back.
Who's on the executive board of the rail safety regulator? Charles Horton.
So they are not equipped to actually judge rail safety.
Chief Executive of Southern. They are not equipped to manage this dispute or give independent judgment. They are responsible for running risk. They are happy to have guards on trains on 70% of the railway. They are happy to have 30% of it run DOO. There is no reason and no intervention by the RSSB to change the operating mode on that railway. And if Southern had chosen not to do it, there would be no dispute. And guards would be working normally and passengers would be happy.
This makes no sense to the people I represent. This kind of dispute.
They want guards on their trains.
What they want is an efficient, functioning railway for which they pay a fair price.
And the reason
you should be partnered.
You should be
partners in this day and age, not to go to the 1970s and a dispute about restrictive practices on the railways.
Are like the 1870s, not the 1970s.
Well, let's go back to the 1970s. Do you accept that the unions don't have the muscle that they did then? That eventually the government will win because you're not as powerful as you were?
Well, you assume I didn't know we were in dispute with the government. Apparently are. Maybe the Tory MPs can tell us why that is. They are the unseen hand at the table. Peter Wilkinson is the man who set out to bash the unions.
Franchises.
We do not want a dispute on Southern or anywhere else. The company is imposing changes that are the detriment of safety and to the detriment of the public. If they hadn't sought to impose their contracts in the middle of this month, there would be no dispute at Southern, and we would all be working normally.
Peter Wilkinson wants to break the unions. You saw that in Michael Crick's report. That's in writing, his writing. He's the man who runs the franchises for the government.
Well,
used to be a consultant for Southern.
Let him finish.
Well, do we actually think that the railways are going to be any better run if we simply move the management to another body?
But answer that question. The government wants to break this strike.
Well, I think the people I represent want to break this strike. I want to break this strike. This seems completely unreasonable to me, to be imposing this level of disruption. When the safety case, frankly, is not made, and the body that's responsible for overseeing it, you're now saying, is packed with people who are not interested in safety.
Drag incidents are on the rise across the railway.
I simply don't buy that the body that's there to oversee rail safety, I would take their judgment. And what I would actually want to see is the RMT behaving like a union in the 21st century, trying to best represent the interests of its members by making sure it's in a partnership to actually deliver a successful service,
and we
a
make
successful
thousands
service
of agreements
for the people,
every year with reasonable companies.
For the people that
you
use
are
it.
backing up a politically driven agenda to try and break my union and to try and break the guards on Southern. What you need to do is get out of the arena and let us make an agreement with Southern on a reasonable basis, which is what we'll be seeking to do from tomorrow.
You support the government breaking the unions in the way they did in the miners' strike. You just said
I support the people I represent.
You said you wanted to break the union.
I support the people I represent getting a fair deal by paying a fair price for a decent service.
But does that mean more government money? You didn't answer that earlier.
It will almost certainly mean continued government investment in the infrastructure. Some of these tracks are 90 years old. Mick will know this better than I, because he's presumably an industry expert. The investment in London Bridge is long overdue. And there then needs to be a partnership between the rail companies and the trade unions and everyone who's involved in running this railway to try to get that investment in as painless a way as possible, accepting there are bound to be costs to the customer. And it's not being done. The people I represent are being kneed cheerfully in the groin by having this reckless, unnecessary dispute at the moment the railway is under most pressure.
Crispin Blunt, Mick Lynch, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you very much.
Jackie.
Well, it's just the latest in a series of provocative comments. But Donald Trump's off-the-cuff suggestion that gun owners could take matters into their own hands and stop Hillary Clinton becoming US president is seen as more serious than the rest. His critics say it's incitement to murder. Mr. Trump's team say it was clearly a joke, but like many of Mr. Trump's jokes, it had the whiff of danger about it, as our Foreign Affairs correspondent Jonathan Rugman now reports.
At best, it was a joke in poor taste. At worst, reckless incitement to violence. Donald Trump in North Carolina last night appeared to suggest Americans could use their constitutional right to bear arms to kill Hillary Clinton.
Hillary wants to essentially abolish the Second Amendment. By the way, and if she gets to pick her judges, nothing you can do, folks. Although the Second Amendment people, maybe there is, I don't know. But although the Second Amendment people...
Watch it again, and this spectator's transition from shock to amusement says it all. Americans have been set free to think the unthinkable, and Trump supporters love him for it. Hillary Clinton hasn't responded directly. Why should she, when simply not being Donald Trump is proving enough to keep her ahead? Though her vice presidential pick expressed disbelief.
Nobody who is seeking a leadership position, especially the presidency, the leadership of the country, should do anything to countenance violence, and that's what he was saying.
Not so, Mr. Trump said later, claiming he was only urging gun owners to vote against Clinton.
I think you're talking about the power of people that are in favor of the Second Amendment, and they have tremendous political power.
Tours the world on private jets, protected by armed guards for 30 years.
And as if by magic, the National Rifle Association began running these ads, claiming Clinton gun controls posed the real danger.
An out-of-touch hypocrite, she'd leave you defenseless.
For the last year, Hillary Clinton has dominated the polls. Then a few days after Donald Trump's speech to the Republican convention, he moved just slightly ahead. It was short-lived. Trump's numbers continued to fall after July the 30th, when he quarrelled with the parents of a Muslim soldier killed in Iraq. Today's poll averages have Hillary Clinton over 7 percentage points ahead.
You gotta see this guy. Oh, I don't know what I said. I don't remember. He's going like, I don't remember.
With her rival seemingly unable to self-censor, she is turning his gaffes into advert medleys, each one helping bring more prominent Republicans to her corner.
I'm Hillary Clinton, and I approve this message.
Hillary is my next choice.
Excuse me?
Yeah. No, it's not hard to figure out. Donald Trump lost me a long time ago. He does and says everything my mom and dad taught me never to say and do. He doesn't understand the basic requirements of being president of the United States, and frankly, he's dangerous.
The word dangerous now haunts Donald Trump's campaign. But the question remains, is not being Donald enough to win?
Your love and compassion.
Americans like a story to believe in, a futuristic vision. and maybe neither candidate has really given them that yet.
Reporting there. Well, I'm joined now from Washington by Neil McCabe, the former editor of Guns and Patriots magazine. He's now a political correspondent for the right-wing US news network Breitbart and a contributor to Armed American Radio. Mr. McCabe, Donald Trump has gone too far this time, hasn't he?
I don't think so. It was interesting during that last piece that you ran where Hillary Clinton felt that she didn't have to get involved because Donald Trump was doing the work for her. I think that the people in the media, especially on the left-wing side, are doing a lot of the lift for the Clinton campaign and the Democrats. I don't think he was calling for the assassination of Hillary Clinton, and I don't think you or anyone believes it either.
Well, his camp say it's a joke, but there are many people, Republicans included, who say at best it's in very poor taste and at worst it is positively dangerous.
Well, I don't know how dangerous it is, and you know, who's to judge what's in taste. I think one of the things that's interesting is
he's not a stand-up
it's
comedian,
difficult
though,
to
sir.
translate.
Is he standing for president?
He is standing for president, but I don't think he called for the assassination of Hillary Clinton, which is what people are suggesting. I think that in itself is reckless.
The former Representative Gabby Giffords, as you know, was horrifically injured when she herself was shot. She said today, politicians' words matter. When they affirm violence, we should fear violence might follow. She has a point, doesn't she?
I think that Gabby Gifford and her husband have done a lot to help the Democratic Party, and they've endorsed Hillary Clinton. And this is the kind of thing that I would expect them to say to expose this media kerfuffle.
Sorry to interrupt you, but she has also been a victim of horrific violence. And she says politicians' words matter.
Well, I'm not surprised that she said that, given her role in the Clinton campaign.
Or perhaps what happened to her as the victim of gun violence.
Well, you're certainly willing to take her at her word and to give her the benefit of the doubt. And Mr. Trump has said that this was a poorly executed joke that was misinterpreted and exploited by his political enemies. Why don't you give him the same benefit?
OK, well, Republican commentator Joe Scarborough, I'm assuming he's not one of Mr. Trump's natural enemies, he writes in today's Washington Post that it is time for the party to dump Mr. Trump.
Well, Joe Scarborough works for MSNBC, one of the left-wing news channels here in the United States. And Joe Scarborough has been an apostate Republican for a decade at least. I mean, I can understand how someone outside the United States would not understand the context of Joe Scarborough, but I mean, that doesn't have any effect on me whatsoever.
I mean, just very quickly, there's no doubt that many of Mr. Trump's supporters support him precisely because he is a free spirit and he has a very free tongue. Is there nothing he could say that would offend you, that would stop you supporting him?
I think that what people fail to appreciate is that millions and millions of Americans, especially in traditionally Democratic areas that have suffered over the last 20, 30 years economically, have really clung to Trump as their champion, as someone who can sort of break through this rigged system. And so when he upsets sort of the fancy politicos, I think they might delight in it. Certainly, I mean, that's not uncommon.
Neil McCabe, thank you very much for joining us, Mr. McCabe. Thank you.
Great to be with you.
Kathy.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jackie. Still to come tonight as Team GB lands another medal at the Rio Olympics. We report from the Amazon on the dam projects threatening the rainforest and the Munduruku tribe, whose chief joins us in the studio. And as a new survey finds that more than half of working women have experienced sexual harassment, we debate what can be done to stamp it out. Now, the chairman of the school standards watchdog, Ofsted, has apologised for making offensive comments about education on the Isle of Wight. David Hoare described the island as a ghetto, adding there has been inbreeding, remarks he later acknowledged had gone too far. But he was trying to flag up worries about the educational outcomes of low-income white British children. Our reporter Paul McNamara has been to the Isle of Wight to see how the comments have gone down and whether there are some grounds for concern.
There's always the sun. There's always the sun.
The sun, the sailing, the champagne-swilling merrymakers. It must mean Cowes Week on the Isle of Wight, the highlight of the boating calendar. But away from the yacht clubs, is it always the sun for those that actually live here?
Well, it certainly seems idyllic here. Beautiful beaches, relatively low crime rate. But if you're a child here, your prospects are among the worst in England and Wales. Just 12% of children on free school meals will make it to university. That's 10% less than the rest of the country. And the numbers are just as stark for every other child. Fewer than a third will make it off this island to university.
Poor children underachieving is a problem echoed across England. And amongst the poorest, those on free school meals, Chinese students do best, while white British children achieve the worst GCSE results across all racial groups. Far away from the sweeping sea views lies the Pan Estate, home to some of the poorest children on the Isle of Wight. It's this immersion in poverty that has the biggest factor on future hopes, according to the teachers.
So it's not really just an education issue, it's an issue of poverty and deprivation and a much wider social context.
But looking around, this is an estate in the Isle of Wight. It looks lovely.
It is lovely. There are such huge, lovely areas of the island, but the poverty and the deprivation, you don't see that anymore. This isn't the 1930s with soup kitchens and bread lines. Britain in the 21st century has a lot of the deprivation hidden.
But underachievement is more common on this island. Last year, 57% of children in England achieved at least 5 GCSEs grade A star to C. The Isle of Wight had the 9th worst results in the entire country, with just under half. The reasons are many, including education funding. Spending per pupil here is £4,000 less than in other areas. And being quite literally cut off from the rest of the UK also has a huge impact on aspirations.
So when I used to teach in Leeds, in an inner city Leeds in a special measures school, but they still saw the city and they saw the jobs that they could do there and the careers. But people on the island on a day-to-day basis do not see those, and unless you go into the mainland, they're not going to be able to see those.
These children are some of the apparently aspirational few, hoping to go to university, unlike many of their classmates.
So the people that you were at school with before going to college, the ones that didn't go into college, what are they doing now? And what do they want to do going on?
Yeah, no, they're just doing apprenticeships and like mechanics and stuff. They're just sort of finding what they can do on the island.
Are they happy?
Not a lot of them, no.
I think we are the lucky few. Definitely not on the island. A lot of people don't go to uni. It's a lot of money getting off. It's quite scary if you've lived here all your life.
I know quite a lot of my friends that have had rough backgrounds, and some of them don't see the hope in life anymore. They don't see that there is anything to go for.
Many here are proud of their quiet island life, though it's no secret that white working class students are getting left behind. Just last week, the chair of Ofsted, David Hoare, spoke to a teaching conference about this very subject, but he described the Isle of Wight as a ghetto where inbreeding happens. He's since apologised and retracted his remarks, but for many here, the damage is done.
What did you make of his comments?
I thought they were ill-founded. I thought he sounded ignorant. I don't think it was at all fair.
How do you think he'd fare if he came over to the Isle of Wight to have this conversation?
He would get back alive.
It's not fair just to think because we're sort of cut off from the mainland that we're all a bit slow and nothing happens here, because there's always something going on.
Well, there's something going on this evening here.
There's car boots most days, weekends. It's lovely, lovely place.
Yes, sort of inbred, white. Inbred? No, I don't think so. I mean, it's normal on the island to have 6 fingers and toes on each hand and foot, isn't it?
So some on the island are laughing about these comments, some are angry, but all are talking about this issue. The question now is, will any of it make a difference, or are Britain's lowest performing forever doomed to educational darkness?
Paul McNamara reporting. Well, the poor performance of white working-class pupils in the Isle of Wight is replicated in many of our towns and cities. So is there a way to reverse this trend? Joining me now is Robert Muchamore, the author of the Cherub series of books for young people, and himself the product of a working-class household. And we're joined by Anastasia Deval, Deputy Director of the think tank Civitas. Robert Muchamore, the description of white working-class children failed by education, does that ring a bell?
I mean, I do remember being very alienated at school and not really enjoying school because I think I was just the classic bright kid who was very bored. But as a children's author, the thing that fascinates me, children's authors often say they're a bit like they're a bit like Ofsted inspectors in that we go and we visit schools and we talk to lots of different children. And I've been to, you know, places as fancy as Eton and Gordonston, and I've been to some really rough schools. And the thing that always gets me is teachers almost seem to do their careers the wrong way round. The least experienced teachers tend to be in the underprivileged schools, in the deprived areas. And then when they get promoted, they find themselves very naturally a nice cushy job in a comfortable school. And it almost seems like the most experienced and the most able teachers are just in the wrong place.
Do you recognise that description?
It's actually, you're quite right, Robert. Unfortunately, that is a trend, and a lot of it is, for example, in inner city areas, housing is very expensive. So teachers, younger teachers might rent, then want to move out, perhaps start a family, buy somewhere, and they simply can't afford to do that in the town. So that is a real problem, and sadly, that is one of the things that certainly affects inner city schools. But on the other hand, a lot of people would argue that you've got particular dynamism, enthusiasm, and perhaps actually energy that's needed in some of those schools, which can be incredibly valuable. So you could say in that sense that there are positives as well.
Lots of people have looked at this, which is why it's such a problem that it still exists. There's an awful lot of talk about a lack of aspiration in some white working class families. Is that something that you think is true, or is that being used to, in a sense, blame people for a system that doesn't work for them?
I mean, I'm not a person who studied this in detail, but just my own personal anecdotal experience. You know, when I was 40 years old, I met up with a bunch of people who'd all just turned 40, who I went to school with. Very average comprehensive school in London, and it was really impressive. There was a judge, there were 2 lawyers, there was obviously me, a successful children's author, there was a guy who directed TV commercials. I guess the really interesting thing about that, though, is it was in the centre of London, and when you're geographically isolated, like you are in a place like the Isle of Wight, are those opportunities as readily available?
But equally, although there is talk about opportunity and aspiration, the Select Committee which looked at this said that many working class families have very high aspirations when their children are young, but actually their expectation of meeting those aspirations wanes as they get older. And if that's true, it's profoundly depressing, isn't it? That as they get older, they think there is no way out, there is no route to success for me.
Absolutely. I mean, one of the things that we know is attached to this idea of parental aspirations is parental engagement. And very often we're talking about lower achievement in areas where, for example, industries have been decimated. There aren't jobs. That has an effect on the parents in terms of their morale, in terms of what their aspirations are because of the opportunities available. And that does have a knock-on effect.
In a way, because it's not just about money, it's about social capital. We all know that middle-class parents can be very vociferous in finding the best schools and also making the most of that education once their child gets there. And you may not always be able to access that if you come from a different, poorer background.
I think that's true, and I think it's also about whether you can afford to take risks, because obviously if you've got stability, particularly financial stability, you can. One of the biggest issues, though, also is the fact that we're not seeing enough money going into schools that are not in inner city areas where there is underachievement. And I think that the good thing that has come out of this Isle of Wight scandal, if you like, is that it's raised the profile of that fact. Inner city schools rightly get extra money, but we also need to channel extra money to schools which are in areas which have a different type of deprivation as well.
And we do know that in recent years, young black boys, for example, who were much closer to the bottom in terms of how they were doing, the ethnic minorities have risen up. What are we missing with white working class kids?
I think the biggest issue is that it hasn't been seen by governments repeatedly as enough of an issue. It hasn't been recognised as a group that is consistently underperforming. And that is a huge problem, not just, as I say, in terms of channeling funding, but also targeted things, like, for example, extra literacy classes. We know that that's a huge reason why kids don't get on later in secondary school, because they don't have those foundations, or homework clubs, the sorts of things that, again, we are seeing in areas where they're targeting underachievement, but this group simply isn't recognised enough.
Robert, is there anything, do you think, that they could have done at school that would have made your education experience better?
I mean, one of the things is this great debate about streaming and the grammar school debate, and I must admit, one of my major frustrations I had at school was being a bright kid in a class with very average kids, and I often felt I was very bored and very held back. And
so you're in favour of grammar schools?
I would broadly be in favour of grammar schools, or at least some level of streaming in certain subjects within comprehensive schools.
I mean, that's interesting, because a lot of the argument against grammar schools is that poorer kids end up not getting there for all the reasons we've discussed about, you know, the middle-class driven parents are the ones
and
who
it's
can knock the door
such a
down.
nuanced argument, but it is, I mean, my gut feeling is, for me personally, if I'd been amongst a crowd of bright kids like myself, I would have got a lot more out of school.
What about
personally.
the ones left behind?
It's a really interesting question, but the question you asked was about what would have helped me, so I think that would have helped me.
What do you think? I mean, is there a return to grammar schools which is being mooted? Is that the answer?
I don't think it's the answer. I think actually trying to tackle the practical problems, for example, class sizes in many primary schools are far too big. That would have a real impact on building the foundations for kids who aren't able to at the moment. I think that's where we should be concentrating.
Really, really briefly, you do really well attracting reluctant readers, a lot of boys who wouldn't read. The answer, the secret?
I guess it's just creating stories that they can relate to and that they can feel are actually believable.
Robert Muchmore and Anastasia Deval, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Kathy.
Thanks, Jackie. Now, the row in Labour over claims that hard-left activists are using the Jeremy Corbyn supporting Momentum organisation as a means of re-entering the party has taken a new twist. Labour's deputy leader, Tom Watson, who yesterday compared such activists to Trotsky entryists, has now written to Mr Corbyn calling for him to confirm publicly that members of groups such as the Socialist Party, formerly known as Militant, should not be allowed to join Labour. Well, our political correspondent Michael Crick joins us again from Westminster. Michael, tell us what's going on.
Well, this row between Tom Watson and Jeremy Corbyn got a whole lot worse tonight. Last night, a spokesman for Jeremy Corbyn accused Tom Watson of conspiracy theories over his allegations about Trotskyist entryism. Well, tonight, Tom Watson's hit back with a 3-page letter and a 4-page research document substantiating his allegations. In particular, Mr Watson claims that the Socialist Party, who are the descendants of what was once known as the militant tendency thrown out of the Labour Party 30 years ago, he says that they're burrowing their way back into the Labour Party, along with the members of another group, the Alliance for Workers' Liberty, who used to be known as Socialist Organiser and were also thrown out of the Labour Party in 1990. And Mr Watson puts Jeremy Corbyn on the spot and asks him whether he will confirm that Jeremy Corbyn believes, that members of the Socialist Party and the Alliance for Workers' Liberty should not be allowed to be members of the Labour Party. That'll be slightly difficult for Jeremy Corbyn, because way back in the 1980s, Jeremy Corbyn actually ran from his home in North London the campaign that fought to keep the militant tendency within the party.
And I know you're far too modest to volunteer this information, but Tom Watson is actually quoting you, isn't he?
Well, sort of, yeah. He refers to a book I wrote about the militant tendency more than half my life ago, 30 years ago, in which, and in particular, what appears to be a review of my book, which summarises how you can take control of Labour Party meetings. This review says, first, make the meetings boring, flood the branches with procedural requests, the minutes of the last meeting and process. This turns off the faint-hearted, says this review. And those with better things to do, to attend to their family careers or community groups, simply no longer turn up. Now, this review, apparently, of my book, according to Tom Watson, is being circulated amongst Momentum members to advise them how to take over the Labour Party. This is a battle that is going to go on and on and on, and nobody looks like giving up.
Michael, fame at last. Jackie.
A hospital fire in the Iraqi capital, Baghdad, has killed at least 12 premature babies. Rescue workers managed to save 8 babies during the blaze, which took 3 hours to extinguish. It started inside the maternity unit at the Yarmouk hospital. It's thought to have been caused by an electrical fault. Vladimir Putin has accused the Ukrainian security services of trying to stage a series of armed raids on Crimea. The Russian president has said he will not ignore the action, while the Ukrainian government denies the incident ever took place.
This is very disturbing information. Our special services intercepted a subversive reconnaissance party from Ukraine's defence ministry trying to enter Crimean territory. There are losses on the Russian side. 2 of our military have died. We will absolutely not ignore this.
Now, new research has found that more than half of women have experienced sexual harassment at work. For young women aged between 18 and 24, that figure rises to nearly 2/3. The TUC, in collaboration with the Everyday Sexism Project, say their study, titled Still Just a Bit of Banter, represents one of the most extensive studies into workplace sexual harassment ever carried out in Europe. Their research reveals that nearly a quarter have experienced unwanted touching, like a hand on the knee or on the lower back, whilst in their place of work. It finds that nearly 1 in 3 women have been subject to unwelcome jokes of a sexual nature while at work. 1/5 of the women surveyed said they've experienced unwanted verbal sexual advances at work. And almost 4 out of 5 women who claimed they'd been sexually harassed at work said they didn't tell their employer about what was happening to them. Many women said they feared that reporting any harassment would negatively impact on their career prospects. Well, joining me to discuss those findings are Laura Bates, founder of the Everyday Sexism Project, and Catherine Hakim, the author of Erotic Capital, The Power of Attraction in the Boardroom and the Bedroom. Laura Bates first. There is a world of difference, isn't there, between unwelcome jokes and demands for sexual favours. Aren't you sort of blurring the lines here?
Well, I think what's important is that, yes, sexual harassment does encompass a range of behaviours, but that they are all unwanted, they're all inappropriate, and they don't have any place in the workplace. In fact, one of the stats that we found, actually, that you didn't mention there, was that nearly 1 in 8 women has experienced unwanted sexual touching and attempts to kiss them at work. So, yes, there is a spectrum, of course. But I think it's important to stress we're not talking about kind of jokes between colleagues. We're not talking about giving someone a compliment in the workplace. We are talking specifically about harassment, often perpetrated by someone in a position of power.
So flirting with your colleague, that's all right?
I think that this is really important to say that, of course, we're talking about an atmosphere that's created that makes women feel demeaned, uncomfortable, embarrassed in the workplace. If you look at some of the case studies, the people who've shared their experiences with us, it's women having sexual comments made about their bodies at them in the workplace.
But it might be quite hard for some blokes to know where to draw the line and, you know, what's a bit of, well, to quote the title, a bit of banter.
Well, I think that the important thing is that many of these things do get dismissed and brushed off. But I think actually the vast majority of men know the difference. And I think it's quite insulting to suggest that there are a lot of bumbling men out there accidentally flirting and offending women. If you look at the study, actually what we're talking about is much more direct than that. It is targeted, deliberate harassment.
Catherine Hakim, it's quite clear men and women know where they stand, and some of it is totally unacceptable.
Some of it obviously is, and there are some clumsy men around. But there's also a problem of lack of social skills on both sides. Women should have the social skills to turn away an unwanted advances in an elegant way that doesn't offend, just as men should be able to read signals suggesting that their attentions are unwanted.
Why should the onus be on the women, though, to brush off the hand on the knee?
The onus is on both sides to have the kinds of social skills to deal with the fact that in the workplace, when you've got men and women working side by side, some degree of flirtation is going to happen in those times, those periods when people are relaxing. And what goes on at the staff Christmas party, the annual Christmas party, is very often something that has nothing to do with what you would expect on day to day. But an interesting counterpart to this British survey is a French survey, which showed that French women say that unwanted sexual attention is the price that we all pay for wanted sexual attention. And that's the real problem.
OK, so, Laura, we should be more French about this.
I think what's happening here is that we are confusing compliments and attraction and relationships with sexual harassment. In the study, we found that in a large number of cases, it was somebody in a position of control over a victim's career. Think older, married, a boss, taking advantage of a much younger female employee, often somebody on a 0 hours or an unstable contract. This isn't a case of an advance being misinterpreted.
Well, let me put that exact example. That's not acceptable, is it?
It's not acceptable for a boss to take advantage of their status. But again, go back to the Christmas party. A lot of things happen there that people wouldn't want to admit to or recognise as having happened the rest of the year.
So a boss having a fondle with an employee at a Christmas party, you'd say that's OK?
No, I'm just saying that that's where a lot of this kind of thing may happen. We've got to recognise that workplaces are social places as well as workplaces. There are drinks occasionally. People do meet and have social events at work. They have casual periods when they're not actually working. And it's
Laura,
a very fine boundary.
Well, let me put that to you. We're all social beings. You know, what's wrong with having a bit of a laugh and having a few drinks with colleagues, and things might get a bit out of hand?
Essentially, I'd say we're using a lot of euphemisms here. It's really interesting, actually, that when research like this comes out, when we discover that women have experienced unwanted comments, sexual comments about their bodies in the workplace, unwanted touching, we're talking about flirting, we're talking about fondling, a euphemistic term for groping, a form of sexual assault. We're focusing on women. How do women women respond? Shouldn't women brush it off? Isn't it to be expected? Instead of saying it's 2016, nobody deserves to be harassed in the workplace, let's stop it happening. Let's talk about that.
Well, that is the point, isn't it? That what you found in your report, Laura, was that the workplace was more sexist than in the 80s, particularly for younger women. Things are going backwards, aren't they, Catherine?
Well, I've just published a paper about what I call the male sexual deficit, in which I predict that there will be an increase in sexual harassment in all contexts and an increase in demand for sexual services, sexual entertainments and prostitution and all the rest of it. And
just answer the generational point, though. Are things worse for the younger generation? Is the workplace more sexist now?
The problem for the younger generation is lack of social skills on both sides.
Quick response to you from that?
I just think it's fascinating that this is how we respond. We're blaming victims, we're looking at how women should respond, instead of saying that men shouldn't be doing it in the first place. And there's a lot more that employers could do to tackle the problem.
Laura Bates, Catherine Hakim, thank you very much for joining us. Jackie.
To the Olympics now, and the Tour de France winner Chris Froome had to settle for the bronze medal in today's men's time trial. The last competitor to take on the course, he finished more than a minute behind the gold medalist, Switzerland's Fabian Cancellara. Our sports correspondent, Kamian Zerum, reports.
Just rider and bike, no teammates to help with shelter or pace. The Olympic time trial, just under 34 miles, the equivalent of Liverpool to Manchester, and the conditions for all the athletes more Bognor than Brazil. Chris Froome made heavy weather of it after finishing well off the pace in the road race over the weekend. But Froome is the current and three-time Tour de France champion, and his outstanding fitness and determination prevailed, etched deep on his face as he sprinted alone to the finish line. He slipped just inside the medals, a minute off the top spot. Swiss veteran Fabian Cancellara with gold. But it was metalware nonetheless. Bronze, just like he won in London 2012. Team GB are targeting more medals than they won as hosts, something no nation has ever done. They have plenty of good prospects currently competing in the qualification rounds. The men's rugby sevens team came through top of their group after beating the favourites New Zealand today. And judoka Sally Conway beat the world champion on her way to the 70-kilo competition semi-final later tonight. GB had hoped to rise further up the leaderboard today, but rowing was postponed for obvious reasons. Well, not so obvious. The explanation for the diving pool turning an arresting shade of translucent green. Algae, apparently.
And in the last few moments, Joe Clark has just won a gold medal for Britain in the canoe slalom.
And after the break, the problems piling up for Brazil as it hosts the Olympics are well documented. An economic crisis, political turmoil and the Zika virus. But plans to dam the last untouched tributary of the Amazon could be the biggest threat of all. Welcome back. Dozens of celebrities have today signed an open letter to the Brazilian government urging it to resist plans to dam the final untouched tributary of the River Amazon. Such dams would harm important areas of natural beauty and biodiversity, as well as endangering the future of the Munduruku tribe. I've been speaking to the tribe's chief, who's in Britain to lobby companies not to get involved in such projects. But first this from our science editor, Tom Clark.
This is the Tapajós River in Brazil. The valley is home to unique wildlife and a large tribe of indigenous people, the Munduruku. It's the last free-flowing tributary of the Amazon, yet to be dammed by a hydroelectric scheme. But for how much longer? Brazilian state electricity firm Eletrobras has plans to construct several dams across the river. The largest proposed would stretch for 5 miles across the valley. Campaigners fear the Tapajós could end up looking like this, the giant Belo Monte Dam project in the north of Brazil. The area flooded above the dam and drained below it would displace wildlife and people.
The Tapajós River, where they want to build this dam, is probably one of the most important biodiversity hotspots in the Amazon. Lots of species are still being discovered there. There's a huge tribe of Munduruku people, more than 11,000 people who will be hugely impacted by this, as well as riverside communities. So when you look at the human rights issues and you look at the biodiversity issues, they are immense.
Last week, with the world's eyes on Brazil during the Olympic Games, campaigners claimed a major triumph. On the day of the opening ceremony, Brazil's government cancelled environmental permits for the proposed Tapajós Dam. But concerns remain. Plans for the main dam or smaller ones on the same river aren't gone forever.
There are a few major multinational corporations, Siemens is one of them, that is involved in dam projects in the Amazon. We want these companies to say they will not be involved in these mega dams in the heart of the Amazon before contracts are signed.
That's why, when much of Britain is following our sporting tribe's successes in Brazil, a delegation from the Munduruku has flown here. They want to lobby global engineering giant Siemens to forego any future involvement in Amazon dams. It has had no role in the yet-to-be green-lighted Tapajós project, but through its interest in German turbine maker Voith, Siemens has in the past contributed to several large dam projects in Brazil. In a statement, Siemens told Channel 4 News,
"We are always mindful of the environmental and societal impact of any large infrastructure project in which we could become involved. It is the responsibility of the sovereign Brazilian government to work with scientists, NGOs and its communities to help secure the most sustainable, reliable and affordable supply of power for the people of Brazil."
The company also told us it will be happy to meet the Munduruku delegation at Siemens HQ in Frimley, Surrey, tomorrow.
Tom Clark there. Well, I've been speaking to Chief Arnaldo Caba Munduruku, an Indigenous leader whose community would be threatened by the building of these dams. I started by asking him how important it was that the Brazilian government had decided to delay construction of the main dam on his tribal lands.
It's good news, but this doesn't mean that this is where it will end. We don't want this dam to be built because I've seen what it means to build a dam in these areas. We're still scared that they will soon build it, and we're worried because they don't want to build just one, but several. And we're scared that if they go ahead with it, we'll be forced off our lands. When I think about the dams that have already been built, all you see is complete destruction. The land is flooded and completely destroyed.
The Brazilian government say quite clearly these dams are needed to create power for millions and millions of Brazilians who desperately need to improve the quality of their life. You're a small community. Why should your needs be put above those of millions and millions of Brazilians?
It's true that there aren't many of us, but that doesn't mean we're not important. We're not just a community. We too form part of the natural world, the rivers, the fish, the animals. They need to respect this and respect our way of life.
You mentioned the natural world, the environment there. Of course, we see Brazil hosting the Olympics. At the opening ceremony, a good deal was made of the environment, of the rainforest. Do you think, though, Brazil is truly committed to looking after both the rainforest and the environment at large?
The Brazilian government doesn't have a real commitment to the environment. Because of this, so much sacred land has already been destroyed. Land, animals, rivers, fish, all of it. There's been so much destruction in our region. This is why we're fighting the Brazilian government not to build anything. The forest has already been hugely reduced. All they do is kill everything that lives there. We want them to do something to help our indigenous communities instead.
Chief Arnaldo Caba Munduruku, thank you very much for joining us.
And just before we go, a reminder of that breaking news. While we've been on air, Britain has won its second gold medal at the Rio Olympics. Joe Clark was quickest down the course in the K1 canoe slalom. It followed earlier bronze medals in cycling and shooting.
That's all we've got time for tonight, but we'll be back tomorrow at 7.
So that's Channel 4 News. A very good evening.
Good evening.